Eugene Lee, thank you so much for joining us on the People Leader Accelerator podcast. Really appreciate you taking the time, being willing to spend some time with Jess and myself. I mentioned we don't actually know each other all that well. We just recently got introduced by a mutual friend and acquaintance, Kim Cooper. Hello. Thank you again for the connection. I just thought it would be really special, Eugene, to have someone with your particular background and perspective speak with our audience. Our audience, of course, being largely mid to senior HR leaders, mostly at tech companies. And you're an investor. You're an investor largely in HR tech companies, not just tech, but specifically HR tech. And that's a viewpoint that could be really useful for us in HR and other professionals to understand those perspectives as a stakeholder. And I'll stop talking and let you share a little bit more about your background, and we'll start peppering with you with questions right after that.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, just for a quick background on myself, I started my career off as an M&A investment banker. I'm based here in the Bay Area, so started my career off there. Went to Yahoo as big public company. I like to say when Yahoo was better than Google, so it kind of dates myself of when I was at Yahoo, but was in their biz ops team. And then kind of went on this 15 plus year startup run, was part of a couple founding teams, had raised venture money, ultimately sold both those companies, one to Google, was at Pinterest during some of the high growth years before moving back to the SaaS side of things. Most of my roles were either leading biz ops teams at those various companies. And then obviously that's very early stage startups. I own most of all the business side of things, everything non-product and eng. So familiarity of HR and some of the practices, I have some actually from a practitioner's perspective, but I would say I'm not obviously an expert, or no one would ever hire me as an HR professional. And then after that, I transitioned over to the investor side. I've been with OMERS for about a little over 6 years now. My focus areas, I've been looking at early stage investing, which is for us, it's Series A, B, C type companies. And then I cover the enterprise. And the enterprise is how I think about it as those functional teams at an organization. Could be sales, could be finance, and then obviously HR, or anything that kind of cuts across, that corporate stack. You've kind of mentioned that we've have a deep love for HR tech. We've been looking at it for quite some time now, and think it still continues to be an interesting area to look at given all the AI capabilities and enhancements that have come about in the last couple of years.
I love that, HR tech is a particular focus, because I know there are times where HR tech is especially sexy and sometimes where it's less so. I'm curious for you, what made this part of technology especially attractive to you as an investment, and how has that changed over the course of the time that you've been investing?
Yeah, I think at first and foremost, if you look at any organization, people costs represent the majority for the most part. I'm generalizing a little bit, but represent the most of the cost base for running a company. So any types of, especially I'm going to talk in a little bit of an AI kind of sense, but any gains on that side from a people and efficiency perspective can create a huge amount of leverage for a company to go invest in other potential areas, whether that's building product or other kind of strategic initiatives that they might have. So when that represents such a large cost basis, trying to figure out technologies that can help enhance that group, your organization, your culture, your DNA, I think people are the DNA of companies. That becomes an exciting area for us to look at. The other thing I'd say is, like, if you look back historically, HR has always been obviously core to a company, but from an investment perspective or an innovation perspective, we've kind of gone from how do we digitize a lot of these processes of how do I pay people, how do I hire people, how do I do performance management? And now I think with AI, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it a little bit, it's transitioning a little bit from obviously that digitization to more kind of judgment around the data, the automations that you can create with technology, that is obviously increasingly becoming more AI focused.
Could you give a couple of examples from your investments of companies where you were like, this is so compelling, and what made it so compelling for you around what was that kind of advantage that you saw?
I'll talk more about trends that I think that are interesting now. I've always centered my universe around, from an investment perspective, when we look at the enterprise, around pockets of data that you ultimately want to own. Popular categories, just for reference and analogies, are obviously sales has a lot of prospect data and ultimately customer data. Finance has got finance data. And then people have a whole host of things that you can measure and optimize from a people perspective. And I think it's what you do with that data that ultimately becomes more interesting. And so when you think about more popular trends, maybe to nowadays, I think there's a whole host of, I think, interesting companies around upskilling. And upskilling has changed in its definition, I think, in the last, call it, year or so. A lot of interesting areas. And these are just, for me, are people analytics and how did that become more predictive in nature with this host of data that you ultimately are getting and creating. There's obviously interesting AI workflows and automations that take you from sourcing to recruiting and the whole platform of hiring that are pretty interesting. I think those to me are the most interesting spots to investigate. And I think the last one I'll touch on is I don't know what it looks like because I haven't seen it yet, but I'd love someone to reimagine the performance management space. We're going through our own reviews and performance management of ourselves and our teams, and it's still a pretty painful process. And so anything that can make it easier, faster, less procedural would be a huge boost in my bucket.
Yeah, I mean,
Agreed. We'll get right on that.
Yeah.
well, I think AI is definitely part of that transformative lever of what will come of it and who ends up leveraging it in interesting ways. We were just talking to a cultural psychologist yesterday who was mentioning an interesting piece of research around when AI is giving feedback and it's a trusted AI source that people actually take the feedback better and less defensively, and they're more likely to act on it. And that was really fascinating. So if you think about that with the tie to performance management, it is an interesting overlay with the AI trends.
Was that because they're less emotional because it's from an AI generated, experience?
It was partly that. Yeah, it wasn't as kind of personified, and there were also less biases involved. So,
Yeah.
and you could kind of trust it because you weren't like, oh, are they telling me this because they really want me to be better at it? Or is it because, they have the secret agenda or that it would actually benefit them if I do it this way? And so the level of sort of less self-interest was an interesting overlay that we were exploring too. I'm curious, you had mentioned you've seen quite a bit of difference in the way that upskilling has been talked about. And I'd
Yeah.
love to double click into that for a moment, just understand like how was it being talked about and framed from your perspective, and how is it now being talked about?
Yeah, to me, the general theme I think I've always seen around upskilling is what are the courses that will make you better at your job, let's say, or let's provide you the resources and training to make you better at your job. I've seen things that I think are also very interesting where maybe you're in the wrong job in itself. Maybe you're a marketer, but you really should be in product. And so how do you kind of gain some of those skills and just naturally kind of go over to that function? I think what's more interesting right now is this. I've seen more people leaders talk about AI transformation, and actually people leaders are taking that on within an organization. And I've seen titles be given to people leaders around AI transformation. It's more about changing the culture of how people should adopt AI and then elevating just the level of work that gets done, that it should be owned by a people person versus maybe IT, which I think maybe not traditionally, but maybe because it's a technology, it might have naturally fallen under IT. But I like how it's been kind of shifted a little bit more towards the people leader to kind of figure out what are the components to make a great organization, and then how do we theoretically upskill and encourage people that your jobs are not at risk. Theoretically, it's about how do we enable you with those AI skills and make you more productive? And I think that cultural shift is very tough right now because the stigma around AI is coming for your job. And it might not be in certain cases. And so how do we leverage AI for the benefit of a company going forward?
That fear is real. We've seen layoffs in tech, thousands of people laid off from, big tech companies with some announcements around AI. And there have been some missteps along the way. I think Lattice talked about an awkward implementation of an AI employee, and that didn't go super well.
Yeah.
I wonder, Eugene, you work with a bunch of different organizations. You invest in a number. I think you're on the board of 6 different companies right now. From your vantage point, what's the highest and best way that an HR leader can help their org be more successful?
I think it's caring about your people and how to make the people at your organization the best possible workers for your organization. So that can be trying to find the right talent, that could be upskilling and putting them in the right positions to succeed. I think that's part of the role of a people leader, is to think about all those things, not from a reactive perspective, but from a proactive perspective. And so getting ahead of these trends and how new technology is going to potentially change an organization, I think is kind of critical for the people leader to be at the forefront of that. And I think that gives you an opportunity to really shine and be a partner, a real strategic partner to the CEO, the CFO, your other peers within an organization. Because again, going back to my original statement, I 100% believe people are the heart of an organization. Aside from with the product that you're actually building, people make the organization go. And so how do you prepare for all these potential organizational changes that AI is undertaking?
The thread I'm hearing there, and correct me if I misstate this, is that an HR leader is managing probably the highest cost part of an organization. And their opportunity to make the org more effective is to maximize or optimize the productivity of those human resources. And that could be through the tools that they use. It could be through change management. It could be through traction, retention, selection, but ultimately, how effectively does this workforce work to get the work to its goals?
I think you're spot on, because if you are able to make those decisions, or you help the organization make those decisions, you're theoretically making the organization move faster and potentially maybe save some money that enables you to go invest somewhere else. Speed and cost are a lot of things that us as investors think about, because those are some of the growth vectors that enable a company to have venture scale. And so if you can sit in those conversations or be a part of those conversations, and I think AI does, if we all believe in people leaders should have that AI transformation responsibility, then I think you absolutely should have a seat at the table.
I'm hearing, maybe these are my words, that efficiency matters for sure, but effectiveness and speed might matter even more, especially in the venture community.
I think you're generally correct. I think it's situation specific.
But one of the things we talk about in the People Leader Accelerator program, the curriculum that senior HR leaders go through, is the trap of working on disconnected HR things. Here's this imaginary list of programs and activities that all good companies or all good HR teams will do. And that's a trap if those things that you choose to work on are not clearly and directly connected with helping your org execute better.
From my perspective, you should think about outcomes. What are the outcomes that you're working on, and work that way, and then prioritize that way. And I think this is probably the largest outcome that you could potentially influence versus a different program or a benefits program or maybe a recruiting tactic. I think this is what everyone's talking about that could fundamentally change how you run an organization or build an organization.
Yeah, maybe for the benefit of our audience that might not have as much depth in venture investing, what are some of the more common outcomes that an investor might be looking for? Power law or valuation change, or Jesse, we're going to add something.
I was just going to add, since you look at series A, B, and C, oftentimes, like, how does that shift over the course of those series raises? Because we do have a lot of audience members who are in VC-backed companies. And sometimes it feels like a bit mystical or like a black box of what are we working towards and what do our investors want for each of these stages to unlock sort of that next stage of growth.
At the end of the day, the goal for us as venture investors is to return capital to our LPs who have given us money to do effectively our jobs. And in order to do that, we need to invest in companies that grow massively to justify a certain valuation that ultimately justifies either going public to provide dollars back, or in certain cases, an acquisition. And there's several ways to do that. One is, I already talked about scale and growth, and actually the speed of that growth from a venture perspective does matter. Or it could be, in some cases, some companies get liquidity from an acquisition perspective because they've created something that's just so strategic in value, and it's a little bit different of a type of an acquisition, but it does happen. We've seen it in the past. So I think, I won't say every, but most investors along the series A, B, C, and even past us, there's certain metrics that we like to see. And in every case, it's a little different, but there are some benchmarks that you like to see from going from an A to a B to B to a C and C and onwards. Now, A has kind of blown some of those metrics up because we've seen companies grow faster than ever, which creates higher valuations potentially because it attracts more venture investors. It is competitive. There's a lot of money out there, but the goal is to return capital, more capital, obviously, than we put in. The more, the better. And so it really goes back to the growth story.
I feel like there's still so much mystery
Yeah.
around venture investing. And, we in HR, on one hand, we will sometimes use the words, I'm not a numbers person, or I'm here to support the people and I'm less comfortable with the P&L. And we try to, help those HR leaders, ramp up and feel more comfortable. But there's still some distance between the finances of the org and then the interests of the investor. And there's this opportunity, if you understand who your stakeholders are and what they care about and what they're trying to get to, you will be more effective at driving towards those outcomes.
Maybe another way to think about it is it's somewhat math, right? For most investors, they're trying to create a return on their investment, and most want to see at least call it 10x or higher. It depends on different funds because they have different strategies, but the goal of a single investment for the most part, again, generalizing, is to return the fund. Or, public companies right now they're bigger and bigger. So most public companies, it used to be if you hit the $100 million mark on revenue, you could go public. Now that has shifted up where it's 300, 400, still growing, maybe even profitable in some cases, or EBITDA break even. So the metrics have gotten higher. And so that just kind of puts you in the ballpark of, if I'm at a company, what are some of those goal metrics that I need to get to? And it has to be within a certain time frame. Theoretically, like you want to see a return in a certain time frame.
And it's interesting too, because it used to be 20 years ago that it would be venture backed maybe for 4-ish years. And that aligned to like the equity structures that employees were receiving, and an IPO would likely happen. And now that time frame has extended quite a bit. And we've seen examples. I think Stripe is a very famous one around having stayed private for much longer. What's your take in terms of what is reasonable timing for companies to be staying private, and what is your role as an investor in, what is that okay timeline or the amount of speed that we want to see alongside it? Because you have LPs who are also saying like, hey, I gave you money, like when am I going to get it back? And what's going on?
Totally. I mean, I think, a 7 to 10 year horizon, depending on when you invest, seems logical, at least to be at the opportunity to potentially go public. There's a lot of external factors to a market, when timing, all that kind of stuff that influence that you just don't have control over from a company perspective. But I think that's a very reasonable time period. But I think it's still TBD with these newer AI companies that have come out where they have grown very, very rapidly. We've all heard them where they might be able to go out earlier if the public markets will have them, in a sense. And I think that story is still untold because we just haven't crossed that yet. But I think from a Stripe perspective, they've got all their reasons for wanting to stay private. It's theoretically easier. They don't have to answer to some of the SEC stuff. But I think that's a typical horizon for us. Our influence, at least this is mine, is we're always going to want to do right by the company and the founders. And so, yes, do we want to push for some sort of liquidity at some point? Because we have bosses too that demand capital back. If you have that opportunity, you're going to want to optimize the return. And so if it's an extra year, you don't want to theoretically try to get out and have a bad performing IPO in a bad external market or market dynamics versus potentially rating. You've just potentially decreased your value. So I think it's always a discussion. And we're just one investor as part of the board, right? There's multiple other constituents and board members to have that discussion.
I'd love to dive into that a bit more, like the board, because it often is talked about as like a single entity, as if like the board is coalesced and y'all are mind meld and have like a single opinion. And I'm curious, you're on 6 boards. How do you think about the range of like the role that the board plays, and how do you think about your role with the board?
Yeah, I try to think of my role as not killing the company. And so I think there are potential situations where bad advice can be given. My approach has always been, let's debate and provide frameworks for discussion for us to make an ultimate decision. And I'll lend my point of view, but there's other people that are around the table that may have experienced something different or that might change. That's why you have a board, right? Is to have that collective debate and discussion around trying to move the company forward. I think one interesting thing that, if your audience wants to know some of the dirty little secrets is
Absolutely.
every investor on the board comes in at theoretically a different time. If Series A investor who leads that round will take that board seat, the B that led that round will typically take that board seat, and so on and so on. But they all have different motivations. And when you ask me the question of the influence, everyone's got slightly different motivations, especially the time points that they got in. It is, yes, one entity, the board, but it can be contentious at times because people have different bosses. They want different things. One might want to get out, and so it does matter from founders and perspective of who you select on your board, because it is a long time period to be on a board, 5, 6, 7, 10, however many years, right? And so it's pretty important.
Eugene, I have a follow-up question on board interaction. I guess this is for, again, our audience of HR professionals.
Yep.
At Series A, B, C, is the head of the HR function typically at a board meeting or typically not? What type of interaction might they expect to have with the board, if any?
I think it varies depending on the stage of investment. I think at the early stages, call it the Series A, typically not. There might not even be a head of HR quite yet. Maybe it's the talk of the board of, hey, it's time to try to bring someone in. In my experience, the people leader is generally at the board meetings, the appropriate times of the board meetings. Sometimes they're in all the team discussions. Sometimes I've seen different ones where, you bring in the leader when it's their section. It's just how different people want to run their different board meetings. I've always had great conversations and relationships with the people leader because they have a pretty good pulse of the company and, more importantly, the team and how motivated the team can be or is at that moment. And so I think they are a critical part of it. And usually at the board meetings, there is a section and we want to talk about the people in the team.
In that section, is there a short list of things that you would, typically really like to see?
I think anything that has data around it is key. I mean, typically I would say what gets presented for the most part is kind of more around hires and strategic hires, and then kind of split outs of our people and movements of people around the organization. And like, how are we pacing to that? I think understanding kind of the softer stuff is also important, not just the data of, again, team culture, motivations. What do we need to kind of get this going? Actually, the last 2 board meetings that I've been at, there was a section on kind of this AI transformation piece. What are we doing to change the culture around our team, around being AI first? Not just our products, but our people. And that's been in the last 2 board meetings of a section that they're leading.
Don't share the name of the company with me, but I will ask, was it HR Tech?
No.
Okay.
No.
I wonder, though, knowing that you do a good amount of work in HR Tech, are there some differences in terms of the HR leader's involvement in an HR tech company versus another type of venture-backed company?
I would say that you can tell that the relationships between the CEO and the people leader are different. I would say that they're tighter. The ones that are at HR tech companies, they understand a little bit better.
And is it that the people leader understands more about the business, or is that the CEO is more aligned with being more people oriented?
I think the latter for sure. The CEO is more aligned with the HR leader about being more people oriented. And then just naturally, the HR leader just knows about the product better. They're probably dog fooding the product, right? And so
Yeah.
like they just know a little bit. They have more insights.
We've heard it called champagne versus dog food recently.
Okay. I should use that. It does sound better.
In some of these roles, I've observed that the HR leader almost becomes more of a commercial facing role in an HR tech company. You can do a lot to spread the word and build awareness of the brand. And frankly, that those have been identified as some of the more appealing HR roles. Like, hey, if you want to do HR at an HR tech. There's some trade-offs there, but boy, you are involved in product things and go-to-market things, and your profile raises tremendously.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I don't think that's specific just to HR, but
Ah,
I've seen that in finance tools. I've seen a company, we didn't invest in this company, but one of their sales leaders was an ex-CFO. It kind of does make sense to some degree, at least, maybe they don't have the sales skills, but you combine that with a traditional AE, maybe you've got a great combination of someone who can really talk the language. I joke around, at least on the VC side of things, VC speak, I had to learn it, right? When coming from the operating world, because it's just a little different. I sounded different when I talked when I came over to this side. And I think I'm imagining it's the same of like when two HR leaders or two CFOs talk, they get each other a little bit faster. And the way that they say things or the words that they use are just slightly different, where maybe you can actually connect a little bit, better or differently.
Yeah, it's a great insight about talent strategy of like whatever your product is, there's probably an element of that that you can pull on. So if it's like Figma and you have a design product, you might have more former designers or people with more of that design eye that you would bring into the organization because they just get the product. And the same thing with HR tech or fintech and all
Yeah.
these other platforms. I'm curious, you mentioned your operator side. You have had some incredible experiences in biz ops and strategy. And I think one of the things that's sometimes tough for people coming up and purely in HR roles is they haven't been in these other roles. And it's helpful just to get better understanding of like what makes it good. And biz ops is one of these functions that sometimes has like a bit of the kitchen sink element of it. And you've been at organizations early stage, later stage. What makes biz ops good?
Let me share my definition of biz ops because I think it can be different. Every organization has it slightly different. And so when I grew up doing biz ops, you are kind of the glue of all the different functional units. And so we were very metrics driven and we thought about scenario planning, business modeling. At Pinterest, my team owns revenue up and above from a forecasting perspective. So it makes it very cross functional and very metrics driven from a kind of dashboarding and understanding. You take those insights and then you can ultimately leverage that into strategic decision making. But it's all at the base of numbers. I think what made BizOps for me a very critical kind of function and where I learned a lot was really the cross-functional, like how do you interact with the different teams and then pull it all together into a singular kind of strategy? Because our job is also to call BS sometimes because everyone's got their own story and their own narrative that they're trying to tell. Sometimes those are great, sometimes those are conflicting. It's our job to kind of, again, pull it all together so we can figure out how to move the ball forward, all through kind of a data metrics lens. I think HR can play a very similar role, just with a slightly different lens on the people. You work with the same functional groups that a biz ops team works with and can be strategic. And I think if you can layer in some sort of data around whatever it may be, headcount efficiency, productivity, popular venture metric is revenue per employee, like if you can start talking that language, I think it will help in terms of you are at the center of driving people strategy, and that encompasses all the different teams. And if you can pull it in together, you're effectively playing a biz ops-ish role. There were teams that I've been a part of where we would have a biz ops person within each function, and we were the centralized team that could pull it all together. And so HR can lend itself to playing in a similar-ish role.
Love that you're bringing that up. It's reminding me when I was at Gusto, we had our finance and business ops team that we called FBOSS, and we would have like our FBOSS partner and our people partner, and they would go together to the business leader to talk about things and to do forecasting and to talk about, what is the state of what is needed and talent strategy and all of that. So I think having that relationship be in lockstep is super helpful and is absolutely one way HR leaders can get more business savvy, because they can ask their biz ops partner, like, why this formula and what's going on in this spreadsheet and how are we thinking about the forecast? So I love that you're pointing it out.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that probably people leaders are probably better than biz ops people are, if they can kind of bring on that quantitative analysis as well to that lens. I think they've always been very good at kind of the softer side, the empathy. I think part of our role, which was difficult, is sometimes we had to have hard conversations with our teams around things aren't going right. We've missed product metrics or we've missed this. And so like learning from a biz ops perspective, learning how to have those conversations, I think maybe more naturally comes from someone in a people leader seat versus for us, we misfired, to be honest, on some of those conversations.
I'll often encourage HR leaders to have a best friend at work and make sure that best friend is in FP&A. Biz ops might be the closest equivalent, like pick one or make them both your best friend. But if you're able to get plugged into financial planning and analysis or biz ops, you will immediately understand what your C-suite cares about, what your investors care about. And then you can start to think about, how do my projects and initiatives line up with that? If you're able to, talk about revenue per employee or vacancy rate or lost revenue as a result of not filling sales roles or time to ramp or these types of things, if you can calculate the cost of turnover so that you can move from, X percent to Y percent, that starts to become much more resonant and impactful inside an org.
I love that you bring that up because at least for biz ops, it can be a very hard role because you don't own anything. You're master of everything, but you're master of none also, right? And so I kind of learned along the way is that you got to figure out what to own so you have a seat at the table to talk about something. And for us, it was either the metrics or at least at Pinterest, it was the model and the forecast. Again, I think there's this opportunity with this AI transformation. You can create that seat at the table to have those discussions with every single team now and really influence kind of the decision making around that.
I'd like to ask two like super basic questions that are less about HR and more just like how to help people think about this function. One is, what is the difference between business operations and FP&A or business operations and finance? Like, where is the line in that? And you talked about decentralization versus centralization of this team. And I've seen it, the debate around it, and the pendulum swinging and all of that. How do you think about what parts should be decentralized, what parts should be centralized?
Yeah, that's a great debate. That could be a whole nother session. I think just a distinction for your first question around FP&A and biz ops. Again, I think definitions vary, from company to company. My definition has always been, while everyone might be metrics focused, the biz ops team should own the metrics and potentially the forecast. So thinking more forward looking on decisions of we need to make that will ultimately impact how we think about products, the business, which ultimately lead to the numbers. Traditionally, I've thought of FP&A as a partner to the biz ops team, and ultimately that forecast should go to them. They should think about the budgets that we should apply from a cost perspective, and then obviously do the measurement around that. So they obviously work very, very closely together. To your centralization, decentralization question, I've always been in the boat, and again, I'm biased, of centralization of a different team. So the biz ops team has potentially a marketing biz ops person, a product biz ops person, an HR biz ops person that goes into their team, but dotted lines into the functional teams. I think the danger, if you have it report into the functional team, is, again, this should be an unbiased point of view of how we should be thinking about the business. And when it reports into a functional team, some biases of how we report numbers or how we choose to report numbers can get a little hazy, where it might not represent the true picture. And I think biz ops' job is to represent the true picture. And so it should live in a finance function. I've seen that's more where I've seen it to live, but obviously partner really well. I think that's the hard thing, is these biz ops needs to partner very well with the functional teams so that we're all on one team. And it's not like I'm some bad guy trying to not work with you and just report all the bad stuff to the exec team.
Yeah. And I think there's also like a similar challenge is what sometimes HR business partners have of like, are we appropriately staffed to be able to support the business leaders at the right ratios to be able to give them everything that they need on top of that? But I love this piece of think about too of the influences that happen if you're structured into one team versus in a centralized team.
And to be fair, I've seen it work both ways, and they've obviously worked well both ways. It's just how I grew up, I guess, in a sense.
Eugene, really appreciate you demystifying some of these things for us and going with the flow as we try to dig a layer or two deeper for the audience. I think we have just enough time for what we call our accelerator round. So there are just a few questions that we'll try to, be snappy with some nuggets of wisdom for our audience that we, ask consistently of our guests. So first, We are all about learning and growth with People Leader Accelerator. Where do you learn from? What specific resources could you recommend that might be helpful to our audience?
I mean, where I learn is through people like yourselves, right? And so a lot of the AI transformation stuff that we talked about, I've heard through Brandon, who's the chief people officer over at Zapier.
We are learning from him too. We actually just got his agreement that he's going to be on as a guest
Oh, great.
feature for this podcast. So we're super excited, especially given he's like a great example of like chief people and AI transformation officer being his newly appointed title as of a little bit earlier this year.
I'm glad I'm going before him so that
He said, okay, great. We'll set very high expectations for when he comes on. Our next question is, one sentence of advice might you have for somebody who's looking to accelerate their career, potentially HR career, in today's environment?
I'd say two things. And one of them helped me along in my career is continue building your network around the people that you want to be around from a either functional or learning perspective, whether that's HR or you want to learn a different function or just surround your people with mentors from different functions. I think early on in my career, I got that at Yahoo. I still talk to many of my Yahoo peers and higher ups, 20 years later. Build your network. That's the most important thing. And I think in today's world, if you're in the now, become AI literate, become an AI translator, understand how you can bring change within an organization with these tools and how it can actually impact an organization. And I think if you can have that fluency of language and understanding the outcomes of what this can be, I think you can be a very powerful individual at an organization.
Amazing. So I'm hearing network and then also AI fluency, so relevant. And yeah, Yahoo, I wasn't there for very long, but it was an incredible culture where people bled purple, still bleed purple,
Yep.
Even today. And it's awesome to see that you're still in touch with so many of them. Last but not least, on the topic of networking, if our listeners are excited to connect with you, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. My handle on LinkedIn is just Eugene J.Y. Lee. It's also my Twitter handle. I've tried to keep it consistent everywhere, so it's easy to find. But those are the two best places to find me and connect with me and send me a message. Always happy to connect.
Perfect. Eugene J.Y. Lee, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of the People Leader Accelerator podcast. Thanks for demystifying a number of areas that are not always really obvious or easy to figure out for HR professionals. So really appreciate you.
Great. Thanks for having me.